Have you ever noticed how easily the heart learns to lean on labels instead of truth, on structures instead of substance, on names instead of the living reality behind them? It is entirely possible, indeed it is common, to speak fluently about faith while quietly starving for God Himself. One may know the vocabulary of belief, the customs of religion, the hymns, the creeds, the rules, and yet never truly rest the full weight of the soul upon God. And this is the quiet danger, that we trust in the idea of Christianity rather than in the God Christianity was meant to reveal. Trust, after all, is not an ornament of belief, it is its backbone. Trust is what a child gives a parent without drafting a philosophy of parenthood. Trust is what a drowning person gives a hand extended into the water, not because the hand has credentials, but because it is there and strong. In the same way, God does not ask first for our systems, our institutions, or even our religious confidence. He asks for our trust. Not trust in how well we understand Him, but trust in who He is when we do not. There is a subtle temptation to hide behind religion, as one might hide behind a wall, safe, familiar, and unmoving. Walls can protect, but they can also prevent us from ever stepping outside to meet the one who calls. Christianity, at its best, is not the wall, it is the road. It was never meant to replace God, only to point toward Him. When the road becomes the destination, the traveler may walk diligently and yet never arrive. God is not an idea to be mastered, but a presence to be encountered. He is not a doctrine to be defended so much as a reality to be trusted. One may argue passionately for truth and still refuse the vulnerability of dependence. Trust requires something more costly than agreement. It requires surrender. To trust God is to place one's unanswered questions, one's fears, one's future, and one's very self into His hands without demanding to see the full map in advance. This is why trusting God feels so much harder and so much more alive than trusting a religious framework. Frameworks are predictable. God is personal. A system can be managed. God must be followed. Religion often allows us to remain in control, to measure our progress, to reassure ourselves that we are doing enough. Trust in God dismantles that illusion. It insists that we admit our need, our weakness, our inability to save ourselves through correct behavior or correct belief alone. Consider how often people turn to faith as one turns to a tool, something useful in crisis, something to be set down once the problem is solved. But God is not a tool. He is not even merely a helper. He is the ground beneath our feet. To trust Him is not to call Him when life collapses, but to stand on Him even when life seems stable. It is to believe that His goodness does not depend on our circumstances, and His nearness does not fluctuate with our feelings. When trust shifts from God to religion, faith becomes anxious. We begin to fear getting it wrong, saying the wrong words, doubting the wrong thoughts. But when trust rests in God Himself, faith becomes strangely free. One can admit confusion without panic, failure without despair, questions without shame. Trust does not mean certainty, it means confidence in someone greater than our uncertainty. And here lies the quiet promise: trust in God, and you will find much, not because God rewards trust like a transaction, but because trust clears the eyes. It allows us to see God where we once saw only rules, to hear His voice where we once heard only noise, to experience grace where we once felt only pressure. What is found is not merely answers, but God Himself, present, patient, and faithful, even when our understanding lags behind. To trust God is to step beyond the safety of second-hand belief and into the risk of a living relationship. It is to move from talking about God to walking with Him, from defending faith to depending on Him, from certainty about religion to confidence in a person who does not fail, even when everything else does. Trusting God rather than trusting Christianity begins with recognizing how easily the human heart substitutes familiarity for faith. We are drawn to what can be named, organized, and explained because it gives us a sense of control. Religion, with its language, traditions, and rituals, can become something we hold on to because it feels solid beneath our feet. Yet God was never meant to be reduced to what we can hold. He is not confined to our explanations, nor contained by our systems. To trust God is to admit that He exceeds our understanding and remains trustworthy even when our understanding collapses. There is a profound difference between believing statements about God and entrusting oneself to God. One can agree with every correct doctrine and still keep God at a safe distance. Trust, however, is personal and risky. It is the decision to lean the full weight of one's life on God's character rather than on one's religious performance. Christianity, when misused, can become a shield that keeps God at arm's length. We recite truths about grace while quietly relying on our own goodness. We speak of faith while secretly trusting our consistency, our morality, or our spiritual reputation. Trusting God strips away these hidden supports. It exposes how often we look to religion to reassure us that we are acceptable, instead of looking to God to receive us as we are. Religion can be practiced without vulnerability, trust cannot. Trust means allowing God to meet us in our weakness, not after we have improved ourselves. It means believing that God's love is not activated by our correctness but flows from His nature. When this trust is absent, faith becomes exhausting because we are always trying to maintain something rather than receive someone. Another danger of trusting Christianity instead of God is that religion can become a substitute for obedience. It is possible to admire God from a distance while resisting His voice. We may defend belief passionately and yet ignore the quiet, unsettling call to forgive, to let go, to change direction. Trust in God involves movement. It requires responding when God speaks, even when the command disrupts our comfort or contradicts our expectations. A system can be admired, a living God must be followed. Trust also redefines how we interpret suffering. When trust is placed in religion, pain often feels like a failure, either of God or of ourselves. We wonder which rule we broke or which principle we misunderstood. But when trust is placed in God Himself, suffering becomes a place where trust is tested and deepened rather than disproven. Trust does not deny pain. It refuses to believe that pain has the final word. It holds that God remains good even when life is not. To trust God is to accept that He may not explain Himself on our schedule. Religion often promises clarity, formulas, and predictable outcomes. God offers presence. He walks with us through confusion rather than removing it instantly. This kind of trust matures the soul. It teaches us to value God's faithfulness more than our comfort and His nearness more than our certainty. In this way, trust reshapes our priorities, quietly shifting us from a faith that seeks control to a faith that seeks communion. When trust is rightly placed in God, Christianity regains its proper place, not as the object of faith, but as the witness to it. Practices become pathways rather than proofs. Prayer becomes conversation rather than performance. Scripture becomes a living voice rather than a mere reference. Community becomes shared dependence rather than shared appearance. Everything points beyond itself to God, instead of competing with Him for our confidence. This trust produces a surprising freedom. We are no longer crushed by the fear of getting everything right, because our hope is no longer resting on our precision. We can repent without despair, doubt without panic, and grow without pretending. Trust in God allows faith to breathe. It makes room for honesty, patience, and humility. It teaches us that God is not fragile and that our questions do not threaten Him. Ultimately, trusting God rather than Christianity is not a rejection of faith, but its fulfillment. It is the return of faith to its rightful center. God does not ask us to abandon belief. He asks us to place belief where it belongs, in Him. When rust finally settles there, the soul discovers that it was not made to lean on structures or ideas, but on a living God who holds it more securely than any system ever could. Trusting God rather than trusting Christianity also confronts the quiet habit of using religion as a substitute for relationship. Human beings are remarkably skilled at keeping a safe distance from anything that might demand too much of them, and faith is no exception. Religion can be practiced without intimacy. One can attend, agree, repeat, and comply, all while remaining internally untouched. God, however, does not remain at a distance. To trust Him is to allow Him access not only to our beliefs, but to our motives, fears, disappointments, and desires. This is precisely why trust in God feels unsettling at first. It removes the carefully measured space we prefer to keep. A relationship cannot be sustained on appearances alone. It requires honesty, and honesty exposes the parts of us that religion often helps us conceal. Trusting God means admitting when faith feels weak, when prayers feel unanswered, when obedience feels costly. Religion gives us words to say. Trust gives us courage to speak truthfully. It is far easier to hide behind familiar phrases than to stand before God with nothing but need. Yet it is in that exposed place that trust becomes real. When trust is misplaced in religion, prayer subtly changes its purpose. It becomes a transaction rather than a conversation. We pray in order to secure outcomes, to maintain favor, or to prove devotion. But when trust rests in God Himself, prayer becomes an act of presence. We pray not to convince God to act, but to place ourselves before Him. Silence becomes as meaningful as speech, because trust is no longer measured by how much we say, but by whom we are with. This shift in trust also transforms how we respond to God's silence. Religion often teaches us to fear silence, to interpret it as absence or disapproval. Trust in God learns to wait. It believes that silence is not emptiness but mystery. Just as a child may not always understand a parent's reasons yet remains secure in the relationship, so the trusting soul rests even when explanations are withheld. This kind of trust does not rush God, it allows Him to be God. Trusting God rather than Christianity also challenges the desire to reduce faith to certainty. Religion often promises clarity, clear answers, clear boundaries, clear outcomes. God, by contrast, invites trust even when clarity is partial. He asks us to walk by faith, not by sight. This does not mean abandoning reason but accepting its limits. Trust begins where certainty ends. It is the decision to continue walking when the path is dimly lit, because the one who called us is faithful. In such trust, obedience takes on a new meaning. It is no longer driven by fear of consequence or desire for approval, but by confidence in God's goodness. We obey not to earn love, but because we trust the one who loves us. This obedience is quieter and deeper. It does not need applause. It grows out of relationship rather than obligation. Where religion may produce compliance, trust produces willingness. This relational trust also reshapes how we see others. When faith is grounded in religion, comparison becomes inevitable. We measure ourselves against others, assessing who is more faithful, more consistent, more correct. But when trust is grounded in God, comparison loses its power. Standing before God levels the ground. We become less interested in proving ourselves and more interested in loving others. Trust frees us from the exhausting task of self-justification. Even doubt takes on a different character when trust is centered on God. Doubt no longer feels like betrayal, but like a question brought into the relationship. Trust allows doubt to exist without fear, because the relationship is not built on flawless certainty. God is not threatened by honest questions. In fact, trust invites them, knowing that God is present even when answers are slow to come. Ultimately, trusting God rather than Christianity means allowing faith to become personal rather than procedural. It is the movement from managing belief to knowing God. It is choosing vulnerability over appearance, presence over performance, and relationship over ritual. In this trust, the soul discovers that God is not merely the subject of faith, but its living center, the one who meets us not at the edge of religion, but at the heart of our real, unguarded lives. Trusting God, rather than trusting Christianity, also reshapes how we understand transformation. Religion often promises change through effort, discipline, and consistency. It assures us that if we follow the right steps, adopt the right habits, and avoid the wrong behaviors, growth will naturally follow. While discipline has its place, this approach subtly teaches us to trust our methods more than God's work within us. Trust in God, however, begins with the recognition that true change is not manufactured but received. It is not something we produce for God, but something God produces in us. When trust rests in religion, transformation becomes a project. We set goals for holiness, track progress, and grow anxious when results are slow. Failure feels catastrophic because it threatens the entire system we depend on. But when trust rests in God, transformation becomes a process of surrender. Growth is measured not by perfection but by dependence. We begin to see that God is less interested in polishing our image than in reshaping our hearts. This kind of change is slower, deeper, and often less visible, but it is also more real. Trusting God also changes how we relate to our past. Religion can teach us to manage guilt by balancing it with good behavior. We try to outpace our failures with improvement. Trust in God allows us to bring our past honestly into His presence. It believes that God's grace is not fragile, that it can withstand the truth about who we have been. Instead of hiding our wounds, we offer them. Instead of rehearsing our shame, we receive forgiveness. Trust frees us from the endless cycle of self-correction and invites us into restoration. This trust is especially tested when change does not happen as quickly as we expect. Religion grows impatient with slow progress. It prefers visible results and measurable success. God often works beneath the surface, where progress cannot be easily displayed. Trust accepts this hidden work. It believes that God is faithful even when evidence is scarce. It rests in the conviction that God is more committed to our transformation than we are, and therefore will not abandon His work halfway through. Trusting God rather than Christianity also dismantles the illusion of self-sufficiency. Religion can encourage a kind of spiritual independence, where we feel strong when we are consistent and ashamed when we are not. Trust in God teaches us to live in continual dependence. Weakness becomes not a failure, but a doorway. In admitting our weakness, we make room for God's strength. Trust learns to say without pretense that we cannot change ourselves by sheer determination alone. This dependence reshapes our expectations of God. We stop demanding instant results and start trusting long-term faithfulness. We learn that God's timing is not careless but intentional. He is not rushing to make us impressive, He is patiently making us whole. Trust allows God to work at a pace that heals rather than harms. It accepts that some transformations require waiting, repetition, and endurance. Trust also transforms how we respond to setbacks. Religion tends to interpret failure as disqualification. Trust in God sees failure as a place where grace can meet us again. This does not excuse wrongdoing, but it refuses to believe that failure has the authority to define us. Trust teaches us to return to God rather than retreat from Him. It believes that God's mercy is not exhausted by our repeated need. Over time, this trust produces a quieter kind of faith. It is less concerned with appearances and more concerned with honesty. It does not boast in progress, nor despair in struggle. It rests in the knowledge that God is at work even when the process feels incomplete. This faith is resilient because it is anchored not in performance, but in God's character. In trusting God rather than Christianity, transformation ceases to be a burden and becomes a relationship. Change is no longer something we chase, it is something that unfolds as we remain with God. The soul learns that it is not held together by discipline alone, but by a faithful God who continues his work patiently, persistently, and lovingly, even when we are not yet what we hope to be. Trusting God rather than trusting Christianity also transforms how we face uncertainty, fear, and the unknown future. Religion often offers the comfort of predictability. It provides formulas that promise safety if followed correctly, assurances that if we do the right things, life will unfold in the right way. When trust is placed in this structure, faith becomes a contract, obedience exchanged for security. But life rarely honors such agreements. Circumstances change, prayers seem unanswered, and carefully built expectations collapse. When trust rests primarily in religion, these moments can shatter faith. When trust rests in God, they deepen it. God does not promise us control over tomorrow. He promises himself. Trusting him means releasing the demand to know exactly how things will unfold. This is one of the hardest surrenders for the human heart. We want guarantees, timelines, signs that remove all doubt. Religion often encourages this desire by suggesting that certainty is the reward of faith. Trust in God accepts that certainty is not always given, and that faith is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Fear reveals what we trust. When our confidence is in systems, fear grows whenever those systems fail. But when confidence is in God, fear no longer has the final voice. It may still speak, but it does not rule. Trust does not deny danger or pain. It refuses to believe they are ultimate. It believes that God remains present even when outcomes are unclear. This trust steadies the soul, not by explaining the future, but by anchoring it in God's unchanging nature. Trusting God also reshapes how we interpret disappointment. Religion often encourages us to see disappointment as a sign that something has gone wrong, either with God or with us. We search for mistakes, hidden sins, or missteps. Trust in God allows disappointment to be experienced without panic. It acknowledges grief and confusion without rushing to assign blame. Trust believes that God can work even through loss, not by justifying it, but by meeting us within it. This trust requires humility. It admits that our perspective is limited, and that God's purposes may extend beyond what we can currently see. Religion can foster the illusion that we understand how God operates, that we can predict his actions if we know the rules. Trust in God dismantles this illusion. It bows before mystery without despair. It recognizes that God's wisdom is not threatened by our lack of clarity. Trusting God rather than Christianity also affects how we make decisions. Instead of obsessing over perfect choices, we learn to walk attentively with God. Decisions become less about avoiding mistakes and more about remaining responsive. Trust believes that God is able to guide even imperfect choices. It releases us from the paralyzing fear of getting everything wrong. We act not because we are certain, but because we trust God's faithfulness to lead, correct, and sustain us along the way. This trust also changes how we experience waiting. Religion often treats waiting as a problem to be solved, a delay to be eliminated through better faith or stronger effort. Trust in God accepts waiting as part of relationship. It believes that God is at work even when nothing seems to be happening. Waiting becomes a place where trust is exercised daily, quietly, without recognition. It teaches patience, not as resignation but as confidence that God's timing is purposeful. In uncertainty, trust produces courage of a different kind. It is not the confidence that everything will go according to plan, but the confidence that God will remain faithful regardless of the outcome. This courage allows us to move forward without demanding assurance of success. It allows obedience without guarantees. Trust learns that faithfulness is not measured by visible results, but by continued reliance on God. When trust is rightly placed, the future no longer feels like an enemy to be conquered or a puzzle to be solved. It becomes a space where God is already present. Trust does not need to see the entire path. It needs only to know the one who walks ahead. In releasing the need for certainty, the soul finds a deeper security, not in knowing what will happen, but in knowing whom it belongs to, even when the road ahead remains unseen. Trusting God, rather than trusting Christianity, ultimately reshapes the very center of where meaning, identity, and hope are found. Religion can easily become a place where we build an identity: believer, faithful, righteous, committed. These labels can feel reassuring because they give us a sense of belonging and definition. Yet identities built on religion are fragile. They must be maintained, defended, and proven. When we fail, doubt, or fall short, the identity cracks. Trust in God moves identity away from what we do or claim and anchors it in who God is and how He relates to us. When trust rests in religion, identity is often tied to consistency. We feel secure when we are disciplined and uneasy when we are not. Faith becomes something we possess only when we perform well. Trust in God offers a deeper grounding. It teaches us that our standing is not rebuilt every time we succeed, nor erased every time we fail. Identity becomes received rather than achieved. We begin to live not as people trying to earn a place, but as people living from a place already given. This shift profoundly affects how we view worth. Religion can subtly teach that worth increases with obedience and decreases with failure. Even when grace is preached, the heart may still measure itself by effort. Trust in God releases us from this scale. It rests in the conviction that God's valuation of us does not fluctuate with our performance. This does not make obedience irrelevant. It makes it free. We obey not to secure worth, but because we are already held by God. Trusting God also changes how we understand purpose. Religion often frames purpose as duty, what we must do for God, how we must serve, what role we must fulfill. While service matters, trust in God roots purpose in relationship before responsibility. Purpose is no longer primarily about what we accomplish, but about who we walk with. Life becomes less about proving usefulness and more about faithful presence. Even ordinary moments gain meaning because they are lived with God, not merely for Him. This trust also reshapes how we face the end of things, whether endings of seasons, relationships, strength, or life itself. Religion may offer answers about eternity, but trust in God offers peace. It is one thing to believe that God exists beyond death. It is another to entrust oneself to Him fully. Trust allows us to release our grip on outcomes, achievements, and legacies. It believes that what is ultimately kept safe is not our success, but our soul in God's care. Trusting God rather than Christianity also frees us from the burden of defending ourselves. When identity is rooted in religion, criticism feels threatening, disagreement feels personal. We feel compelled to protect our position and justify our faith constantly. Trust in God quiets this defensiveness. Confidence no longer comes from being right, but from being held. We can listen without fear, admit limits without shame, and remain calm even when misunderstood. This trust produces a deep inner steadiness. Life still brings loss, change, and uncertainty, but the soul is less easily shaken, not because it has mastered faith, but because it has surrendered to God. Trust creates space for humility, for learning, for growth. It allows faith to mature beyond the need to impress or convince. The soul becomes more rooted, less reactive, more patient. Over time, trusting God reveals that Christianity was never meant to be the foundation itself, but the signpost pointing toward it. The danger was never belief, it was misplaced trust. When trust returns to God, everything else finds its proper place. Belief becomes alive. Practices become meaningful. Community becomes supportive rather than defining. Faith becomes less about holding answers and more about being held. In this trust, the heart discovers something quietly profound. that God Himself is enough, not as an idea, not as a system, not as a reward, but as a presence. Trust teaches the soul to rest there, not because everything is resolved, but because God is faithful, and in resting there, meaning, identity, and hope are no longer constructed from effort or certainty, but received from the God who remains, even when everything else passes.